A desperate bargain. The flickering hologram cast an eerie blue glow over Xylotha's craggy features as he stared at the imposing figure before him. Even reduced to a shimmering projection, Ryzek the Collector loomed large, his reptilian eyes cold and assessing. "Your payment is overdue, Xyloth," Ryzek hissed, his forked tongue darting out to taste the air. "The Kothari Syndicate is not known for its patience." Xyloth bowed his head, his long gray hair slipping over hunched shoulders. "I understand, Lord Ryzek. But the excavation took longer than expected. The relics from the Zareen ruins proved difficult to acquire." Ryzek's scaled hand slashed through the projection. "Your excuses bore me, old man. The Syndicate cares nothing for ruins and relics. Only credits." Those soulless eyes narrowed. "And you owe us a great deal." Xylotha's hearts hammered against his ribcage. The Collector's words rang true. When he'd borrowed the funds to mount his ambitious expedition, he had been certain the artifacts he unearthed would make him a fortune. But the market had shifted in his absence. Ancient Zareen artifacts, once prized by collectors across the galaxy, were now little more than historical curiosities. The proceeds from their sale had barely covered the cost of the dig, let alone his debt to the Syndicate. "I will pay what I owe," Xyloth said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "But I need more time. My contacts need time to find the right buyers, the ones willing to pay for quality." Ryzek silenced him with a look. "Time, Xyloth, is a commodity even the Kothari cannot lend forever. Your debt is to be paid in full. Immediately." The Collector paused, a cruel smile playing at his thin lips. "Unless." Despite the chill that ran down his spine, Xyloth found himself leaning forward. "Unless my son Draxon has come of age. As is tradition, he will soon take a mate and join the Syndicate leadership." Ryzek's gaze sharpened. "I've always found Zelayan females to be exquisite creatures. And rumor has it you possess one of rare beauty." Xylotha's blood ran cold. "Mira? But, she is my daughter. My only child." "You cannot mean." "I can and I do." Ryzek leaned back, steepling his clawed fingers. "Your debt to the Syndicate is substantial, Xyloth. More than you could hope to repay in 3 lifetimes. But your daughter—" He smiled, razor-sharp teeth glinting. "She would fetch a pretty price on the marriage market. More than enough to satisfy honor." For a long, agonizing moment, Xyloth couldn't breathe. Mira was his light, his reason for being. The only family he had left in this cold, unforgiving universe. To even consider. "The choice is yours, of course," Ryzek said smoothly, picking an invisible speck of dust from his immaculate sleeve. "If you prefer the Kothari extraction squads to pay you a visit instead, I'm sure that could be arranged." Xyloth knew all too well what that meant. He'd seen the aftermath of Syndicate extractions before. The blood. The bodies. The lives ruined beyond repair. The thought of such brutality touching Mira filled him with blinding panic. I need time to consider." He managed, his heart's racing. "You have 1 solar cycle." Ryzek's eyes gleamed with triumph. "When I contact you again, I expect your answer to be favorable. For your daughter's sake." The hologram winked out, plunging the room into darkness. Xyloth slumped back in his chair, exhausted and sick with dread. What could he do? He had no credits, no collateral, no way out from under the Syndicate's thumb. Mira was all he had left. His shining star. How could he even contemplate? But if he refused, Ryzek would not hesitate to take her anyway. Along with Xylotha's life. At least this way, she would live. Wed to a monster, true, but alive. And wasn't that all that mattered in the end? Ensuring Myra's survival, whatever the cost. With a heavy heart, Xyloth rose and went to find his daughter. To look upon her beautiful face one last time. To memorize every precious detail, before he shattered her world forever. An unwilling bride. Mira stormed into her father's study, her emerald eyes flashing with fury. How could you, she demanded, slamming her palms down on the cluttered desk. How could you even consider such a thing? Xyloth couldn't meet his daughter's accusing gaze. He kept his eyes fixed on the ancient texts scattered before him, their secrets suddenly meaningless in the face of Myra's pain. I had no choice, he said softly, his voice heavy with regret. Ryzek was quite clear. Either you marry his son, or... He swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. Or the syndicate will kill us both. Mira recoiled as if slapped. So you'd rather sell me into slavery than face your mistakes? Her voice shook with barely contained rage. Am I just another relic for you to barter away? Xylotha's head snapped up, his heart twisting at the betrayal etched across his daughter's beautiful face. No. Mira, please. You must understand. I only want to protect you. By handing me over to a monster. Myra's laugh was brittle and sharp as shattered glass. Draxon is worse than his father. I've heard the stories. The things he does to his mates. She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. I won't do it. I won't be that creature's plaything. Xyloth reached for her, desperate to offer comfort, but Mira jerked away. Mira, please. We have no other options. The syndicate, they'll hunt us to the ends of the universe. There's nowhere we can hide from their wrath. For a long moment, Mira was silent, her gaze distant as she stared out the viewport at the stars glittering against the endless black of space. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and resolute. Then I'll run. She turned to face him, her chin lifted in defiance. I'll steal a ship and disappear into the outer rim. Change my name, start a new life. Her eyes softened slightly as she took in Xylotha's stricken expression. Come with me, Papa. Leave this all behind. We can be free. But even as she said the words, Xyloth knew it was impossible. Ryzek would never let them slip away so easily. His reach was long and his vengeance swift. They wouldn't make it a single parsec before the syndicate's assassins found them. Mira. Xylotha's voice cracked on her name. It's too late for that now. If we run, Ryzek won't just kill us. He'll make an example of us. Everyone we've ever loved, every friend we've ever made, he'll slaughter them all just to prove his power. He took a shuddering breath, hating himself for the words he had to say next. This is the only way, my love. The only way to keep you safe. To keep everyone safe. Mira stared at him, tears glinting unshed in her luminous eyes. And what about what I want, Papa? What about my safety? My happiness? She shook her head, a single tear tracing down her cheek. You're asking me to sacrifice my entire life for your mistakes. Before Xyloth could respond, Mira turned on her heel and fled the room, her sobs echoing behind her. He slumped back in his chair, burying his face in his hands. What had he done? What kind of father was he, to even consider such a devil's bargain? But what choice did he have? He had to make Mira understand. Had to convince her that this was the only path left to them. No matter how much it shattered his own soul in the process. With a heavy sigh, Xyloth heaved himself to his feet and went to prepare for the journey ahead. In just a few short cycles, he would deliver his only daughter into the clutches of the most ruthless crime syndicate in the galaxy. And nothing would ever be the same. As the small transport ship descended towards the Kothari syndicate's compound, Mira felt a chill settle deep in her bones. The sprawling structure seemed to rise from the barren planetoid surface like a crouching predator, all jagged edges and gleaming black metal. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their faces hidden behind reflective helmets. Automated defense turrets tracked the ship's approach, humming with barely restrained menace. Beside her, Xyloth shifted uneasily in his seat, his weathered hands clenching and unclenching on his knees. Mira couldn't bring herself to look at him, to see the guilt and sorrow etched into the lines of his face. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something other than meekly accept the fate being thrust upon her. But she knew it was futile. Rysek's men had been waiting for them at the spaceport, their weapons trained on Xyloth the moment they'd stepped off their ship. The message had been clear, one false move, and her father's life would be forfeit. So Mira had allowed herself to be led onto the transport, a silent, seething presence amidst the rough laughter and crude jokes of her captors. They leered at her, their eyes raking over her slender form with undisguised hunger. She'd endured it all with her head held high, refusing to let them see her fear, her revulsion. She would not give them the satisfaction. Now, as the ship settled onto the landing pad with a shuddering thump, Mira felt that resolve wavering. This was really happening. In a few moments, she would be face to face with the man who had purchased her like livestock. The man who intended to make her his bride, whether she willed it or not. Draxon, son of Ryzek. Her future husband and master. The thought made her stomach heave and her fists clench at her sides. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them all pay for daring to treat her as if she were nothing more than property to be bought and sold. But she couldn't. Not if she wanted her father to live. And despite everything, despite the anger and betrayal still simmering in her gut, Mira knew she couldn't let Xyloth die. Not like this. Not because of her. So when the transport's hatch hissed open and the guards gestured for her to disembark, Mira squared her shoulders and stepped out into the harsh glare of the compound's floodlights. She wouldn't give Draxon or his father the satisfaction of seeing her cower. She was a daughter of Zelaya, proud and strong and unbowed. And she would endure this, as her ancestors had endured so much before her. No matter the cost to her own heart. As she emerged from the transport, Mira was immediately flanked by a pair of guards, their hands resting on the blasters at their hips. They escorted her across the landing pad, the cold metal of their presence more restraint than any chains could ever be. Ahead, the compound doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the bright lights of the interior. Draxon. He was younger than she'd expected, his scaled features almost handsome in a cruel, reptilian way. He watched her approach with hooded amber eyes, one arm draped casually across his broad chest while the other held a gleaming data pad. When she drew closer, he straightened to his full height, towering over Mira and her escort. This close, she could see the patterns etched into his blue-gray scales, the glint of sharpened teeth behind his thin lips. Mira of Zelaya. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Welcome to your new home. Mira met his gaze without flinching, even as her heart raced behind her ribs. I am not here by choice, she said, proud of the way her voice remained steady. And this will never be my home. Draxon's eyes flashed with something that might have been amusement. Spirited. I like that. He stepped closer, his gaze raking over her in a way that made Mira's skin crawl. But your choice is irrelevant. You belong to me now, as payment for your father's debt. He reached out to trace one clawed finger along her cheek. Mira jerked away, revulsion shuddering through her. Draxon only smiled. You'll learn to enjoy my touch in time, he murmured. After all, we'll be spending a great deal of it together. With that, he turned and strode back into the compound, clearly expecting her to follow. Mira stood frozen, bile rising in the back of her throat. She couldn't do this. Couldn't resign herself to a life shackled to this monster's side, enduring his touch, his degradation. But then she caught sight of her father's face, ashen and stricken as he watched from the transport's hatch. In that moment, she knew she had no choice. Squaring her shoulders, Mira marched forward into her gilded cage. No matter the torments that awaited her within its walls, she would endure. The daring captain. The spaceport cantina was a riot of noise and color, a cacophony of clinking glasses, raucous laughter, and pounding music. Species from a dozen different worlds crowded the bar, nursing drinks and trading stories as they waited for their ships to refuel or their cargo to clear customs. In a shadowed corner booth, Captain Jace Riker sat alone, his booted feet propped up on the scarred tabletop. He sipped a glass of amber liquid, the potent Aldebaran whiskey burning a fiery path down his throat. It had been a rough few cycles. The job he'd taken on Rigel 7 had gone sideways fast, leaving him with a damaged ship, a wounded crew member, and a hold full of contraband he couldn't unload without risking arrest. He needed a break, a chance to lay low and make some repairs before the Galactic Patrol caught his scent. This little backwater spaceport had seemed like the perfect place to do just that. But now, as he listened to the chatter swirling around him, Jace found his interest piqued by a particular thread of conversation. Heard Draxon's finally taking a mate, a raspy voice was saying, the words slightly slurred. Some rare beauty from the outer rim. Jace's ears pricked up. Draxon, son of Ryzek. He knew those names, and the reputation of the crime syndicate they controlled. The Kothari were not to be trifled with, their reach extending to every corner of the known universe. A Zalayan, they're saying, another voice chimed in, this one feminine and throaty with drink. Traded to the syndicate to pay off her father's debt. Jace felt a flare of disgust. The Kothari were known for many things, extortion, smuggling, assassination. But trafficking in sentient beings was low even for them. Still, it wasn't his problem. He had his own troubles to worry about. Jace drained the rest of his whiskey and made to rise, his mind already turning to the repairs his ship desperately needed. But then he caught a glimpse of the speakers, and something made him pause. They were a motley pair, a hulking Bravaxian with a scarred snout, and a serpentine Lethean female draped in shimmering scales. But it was the crest emblazoned on their jacket sleeves that made Jace's blood run cold. The twisted serpent of the Kothari syndicate. These weren't just common spacers swapping rumors over drinks. They were Draxon's own enforcers, likely here to collect cargo or strong-arm some poor merchant who'd fallen behind on their protection fees. Jace knew he should walk away. Getting mixed up with the syndicate was a surefire way to end up dead or worse. But something about the casual cruelty in their voices, the way they spoke of this Zalayan girl as if she were just another commodity to be traded, made his gut clench with anger. Before he quite knew what he was doing, Jace found himself sliding out of the booth and sauntering over to the bar. He settled himself on the stool next to the Bravaxian, signaling the bartender for another round. Couldn't help but overhear, he said casually, keeping his voice low and friendly. Sounds like your boss is expanding his collection. He let his gaze drift to the Lethean female, his smile sharp. Suppose even crime lords get lonely sometimes. The Bravaxian's beady eyes narrowed, his meaty hand dropping to the blaster at his hip. Watch your mouth, human, he growled. Draxon's business ain't none of yours. Jace held up his hands in mock surrender. Easy there, friend. Just making conversation. He tossed a credit chip on the bar, nodding for the bartender to pour a round for his new companions. No offense meant. The Lethean relaxed slightly as a glass of shimmering violet liquid was set before her. You've got guts, human, she said, eyeing him appraisingly. Not many would dare speak so boldly of the syndicate's affairs. Jace shrugged, taking a sip of his own drink. What can I say? I've always been a bit too curious for my own good. He leaned in conspiratorially. So, this Zalayan bride. She must be quite the prize for Draxon to go to such lengths to acquire her. The Bravaxian snorted. Prize is right. You should have seen her, all shimmery skin and flashing eyes. His lips pulled back in a leer. Bet she'll fetch a pretty penny on the outer rim bride market if Draxon ever gets tired of her. Jace felt his fingers tighten around his glass, the urge to introduce the Bravaxian's face to his fist nearly overwhelming. But he forced himself to take a steadying breath, to keep his expression easy and open. "Surprised he's settling for just one," he said lightly. "Thought the syndicate boss's son would have his pick of the galaxy's finest." "Oh, he does," the Lethean purred. "But there's something special about this one. Rumor has it she's royalty or some such. The last daughter of a dying world." Her tongue flicked out to taste the air. "And you know how Draxen loves to collect rare things." Jace's mind was racing, pieces clicking into place. A princess from a fallen kingdom, sold into marriage to save her father from the syndicate's wrath. It was like something out of a twisted fairy tale. And now this girl was being held against her will, destined to become the plaything of a man so cruel even his own underlings spoke of him with barely restrained terror. Jace knew it was insane. He had no stake in this, no reason to risk his neck for a stranger, royalty or not. He had his own skin to worry about, his own crew counting on him to keep them flying. But the thought of that girl, proud and defiant even in the face of such a horrific fate, made something fierce and protective rise up in his chest. He couldn't just walk away. Couldn't leave her to Draxen's tender mercies without at least trying to help. Even if it meant taking on the entirety of the Kothari syndicate to do it. Jace finished his drink in one long swallow, relishing the burn. Then he pushed away from the bar, flipping another credit chip to the bartender. "Thanks for the chat," he said to the enforcers, his smile razor sharp. "You've given me a lot to think about." The Bravaxian eyed him warily. "Don't go sticking your nose where it don't belong, human," he warned. "Draxen's business is Draxen's business. You do well to remember that." "Don't worry about me," Jace said breezily, already turning to leave. "I know how to keep my head down." It was a lie, of course. Jace had never been good at keeping his head down, or his nose out of trouble. But as he strode out of the cantina, his mind already whirling with half-formed plans and desperate schemes, he found he didn't much care. Princess or pauper, no one deserved the fate Draxen had in store for his Zalayan bride. And if Jace Riker had anything to say about it, she'd never have to find out firsthand just how cruel the syndicate's heir could be. Unexpected allies. The Kothari compound was a fortress, all high walls and gleaming security sensors. Jace crouched in the shadows of a nearby hillock, studying the patrols that marched with metronomic precision along the perimeter. Getting inside would be no easy feat, even for someone with his particular set of skills. The syndicate didn't take chances with their valuables, and Draxen's new bride certainly qualified. But Jace hadn't come this far to back down now. He'd left his ship and crew in the capable hands of his first mate, Asha, with strict instructions to take off without him if he wasn't back in 12 hours. He didn't plan on needing that long. If all went well, he'd have the girl and be gone before anyone even realized she was missing. Of course, things rarely went as planned in Jace's experience. But that was half the fun. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out a small, disc-shaped device. It was a cloaking generator, top of the line and nearly impossible to come by through legal means. Jace had liberated it from a galactic patrol impound lot a few years back, and it had served him well ever since. He slipped the disc onto his belt, feeling the faint hum as it powered up. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped out from his hiding spot and began to approach the compound walls. The first patrol passed within inches of him, their booted feet kicking up puffs of red dust. Jace held his breath, hardly daring to move. The cloak would hide him from visual detection, but it did nothing to mask sound or heat signatures. Luckily, the Kothari guards seemed more concerned with external threats than any potential infiltrators. They continued on their way, oblivious to the invisible intruder in their midst. Jace waited until they'd rounded the corner before making his move. He sprinted for the wall, his footsteps silent on the packed earth. When he reached the base of the gleaming metal barrier, he paused, studying the surface for any potential handholds or weaknesses. There. A hairline crack in one of the panels, likely caused by some past orbital bombardment. It was thin, barely visible to the naked eye. But it was enough. Jace pulled a small laser cutter from his belt and set to work, carefully tracing the edges of the crack. The metal hissed and sputtered, glowing cherry red as he worked. He had to be quick, too much heat would set off the compound sensors, cloak or no cloak. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a minute or two, the panel split open with a soft pop. Jace caught it before it could fall, lowering it silently to the ground. Then, with one last glance over his shoulder, he slipped inside the walls of the Kothari stronghold. The interior of the compound was a maze of corridors and locked doors, each one leading deeper into the heart of the Syndicate's power. Jace moved cautiously, his hand never far from the blaster at his hip. He had studied the blueprints Asha had managed to slice from the spaceport's records, committing every twist and turn to memory. But there was always a chance that Draxon had made changes, added new security measures since the plans were filed. Jace couldn't afford any missteps. Not with so much on the line. He kept to the shadows, dodging patrols and servants with equal care. The cloaking device couldn't completely muffle the sounds of his passing, and more than once he had to freeze in place as a guard or maid passed perilously close. But slowly, steadily, he made his way deeper into the compound, following the twisting route that would lead him to Draxon's private quarters. Where, if the Syndicate Prince was as predictable as Jace hoped, his new bride would be waiting. Jace paused outside a set of ornate double doors, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment of truth. He wasn't naive enough to think that getting the girl out would be as simple as just opening the door. Draxon was sure to have all manner of safeguards in place, from biometric locks to energy fields. And that was assuming the Zalayan princess even wanted to be rescued. For all Jace knew, she could be perfectly content with her new situation, happy to trade her father's debts for a life of luxury and prestige. But something told him that wasn't the case. Call it instinct, or maybe just wishful thinking, but Jace couldn't shake the feeling that this girl was a fighter. That, given the chance, she'd jump at any opportunity to escape her gilded cage. Well, he was about to find out. Taking a deep breath, Jace reached for the control panel beside the doors. His fingers hovered over the keys, hesitating. Once he did this, there'd be no going back. He'd be making an enemy of one of the most powerful crime syndicates in the galaxy, putting not just his own life on the line, but those of his crew as well. Was it worth it? Was one girl, no matter how unfairly treated, worth the risk? In the end, there was only one answer Jace could live with. Steeling himself, he punched in the override code he'd lifted from a guard's data pad. For a heart-stopping moment nothing happened. Then, with a soft chime, the doors slid open. The room beyond was opulent, all plush fabrics and gleaming surfaces. But Jace barely noticed the decor. His attention was immediately drawn to the figure standing by the window, her back to the door. She was tall and slender, her violet skin shimmering in the starlight streaming through the viewport. Her hair fell in a cascade of shimmering silver, almost metallic in its brilliance. And when she turned to face him, her eyes widening in shock, Jace felt his breath catch in his throat. She was quite possibly the most beautiful creature he'd ever seen. But it was the fierce intelligence burning in those luminous eyes that truly captured him. This was no delicate flower, content to while away her days in pampered captivity. This was a woman who had seen hardship, who knew the cruelties of the universe and refused to bend to them. In that moment, Jace knew he'd made the right choice. "Who are you?" the princess demanded, her melodic voice sharp with suspicion. "How did you get in here?" Jace deactivated his cloaking device, shimmering into view with his hands raised placatingly. "My name is Jace Riker," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm a friend. I'm here to help you escape." The princess' eyes narrowed. "Escape? Why would you help me?" Her gaze raked over him, taking in his battered flight suit and scuffed boots. "You're no Kothari, that much is clear." "No," Jace agreed. "I'm not. I'm just a simple trader who happened to overhear some disturbing rumors about Draxon's new bride. He took a cautious step forward. Rumors that said she wasn't here by choice. Something flickered in the princess' eyes, but her expression remained guarded. And what do you care about my choices? What's in it for you? Jace shrugged. Call it a weakness for damsels in distress. At her scoff, he grinned. Or maybe I just can't resist a challenge. He turned serious. Look, I know you have no reason to trust me. But I'm asking you to take a chance. Come with me now, and I swear I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe, to get you as far from Draxon and the Syndicate as possible. The princess was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching his face as if looking for any hint of deception. Jace met her eyes steadily, his pulse pounding in his ears. Finally, she took a step forward. I don't trust you, she said bluntly. But I trust Draxon even less. Her chin lifted, defiance etched into every line of her face. If you can truly get me out of here, then I'll take my chances with you. Relief coursed through Jace, followed quickly by a renewed sense of urgency. We need to move quickly, he said, already reaching for his cloaking device. Once Draxon realizes you're gone, this whole place will be on lockdown. The princess nodded, scooping up a small satchel from a nearby chair. Lead the way. And as Jace reactivated his cloak, the shimmering field enveloping them both, he couldn't help but marvel at the turn his life had taken. Here he was, a small-time smuggler with a penchant for trouble, about to spirit away the most valuable prize in the Syndicate's collection. It was insane. It was suicidal. And it was, without a doubt, the most exciting thing he'd ever done. As they slipped out into the corridor, Jace's hand found the princess, their fingers intertwining as if they'd done this 100 times before. Her skin was cool and smooth against his, her grip strong and sure. In that moment, Jace felt a flicker of something he'd never quite experienced before. A connection, a sense of rightness that went beyond the adrenaline of the moment. He couldn't put a name to it. Not yet. But as they moved through the shadows, two unlikely allies bound by circumstance and choice, he knew one thing for certain. Ruse and reckoning. The escape from the compound was a blur of adrenaline and close calls, a heart-pounding rush of near misses and desperate improvisation. Jace and the princess, who introduced herself as Mira, fought their way through guards and locked doors with equal determination, their initial wariness giving way to a tentative trust born of necessity. By the time they reached the outer walls, alarms were blaring and searchlights lit up the night, Draxon's furious bellow echoing across the compound. But they didn't stop, didn't dare look back as they raced for the safety of the desert beyond. It was only when they reached Jace's hidden ship, the Celestia's Gambit, that they finally allowed themselves a moment to breathe. Mira collapsed into the co-pilot's chair, her chest heaving and her skin glistening with exertion. Jace wasn't in much better shape, his muscles burning and his lungs on fire. But as he powered up the engines and laid in a course for deep space, he couldn't keep the grin from his face. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd pulled off the impossible. Of course, now came the hard part, staying one step ahead of Draxon and his goons. The Syndicate Prince wasn't likely to let such a slight go unanswered, and Jace knew they'd have to keep moving, keep flying, if they wanted to stay ahead of the storm. But as he glanced over at Mira, taking in the determined set of her jaw and the fire in her eyes, he found he wasn't too worried. Together, they just might have a chance. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of close calls and narrow escapes, planet hopping and doublebacks designed to throw off any pursuit. Mira proved herself an invaluable ally, her knowledge of Syndicate tactics and her quick wits getting them out of more than one tight spot. Slowly, tentatively, they began to open up to each other, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Jace learned of Myra's life on Zelaya, of the loving but strict family that had shaped her into the fierce, independent woman she was. In turn, he found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, his troubled childhood on the streets of Coruscant, his dreams of flying among the stars, free and untethered. Somewhere along the way, between firefights and hyperspace jumps, Jace realized his feelings for Mira had grown into something more than just camaraderie. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, admiring the way starlight played across her skin, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed. He knew it was foolish. She was a princess, born to rule and lead. And he was just a scoundrel, a rogue with no place in her world. But when she looked at him, her gaze warm and open, he could almost believe that none of that mattered. That maybe, just maybe, she felt something too. It all came to a head on a small, nameless moon, where they'd stopped to resupply and lay low for a bit. They were sharing a meal in the Gambit's tiny galley, laughing over some shared joke, when Mira suddenly grew serious. "Jace," she said softly, her hand coming up to rest on his arm. "I need to go back." Jace blinked, sure he must have misheard. Back? Back where? To the Syndicate. To Draxon. Myra's eyes were pained but resolute. "I can't keep running forever. And I won't let my father suffer for my choices." Jace's heart clenched. "Mira, no. You can't." But she cut him off with a shake of her head. "I have to. It's the only way to keep the people I love safe." Her fingers tightened on his arm. "But I need your help." And so, with a heavy heart, Jace found himself agreeing to the most reckless, foolhardy plan he'd ever heard. They'd return to Kothari space, letting whispers of their whereabouts reach Draxon's ears. Mira would offer herself up, the repentant bride returning to her rightful place. And when Draxon let his guard down, convinced of his victory, they'd strike. It was a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice with all their lives on the line. But as Jace looked into Myra's eyes, saw the trust and determination shining there, he knew he'd follow her into hell itself if she asked. Even if it meant losing her in the process. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a cruel mockery of the darkness in Jace's heart. He stood at the back of the grand hall, disguised as a minor syndicate flunky, watching as Mira glided down the aisle in a gown of shimmering starsilk. She was a vision, radiant and regal, her head held high even as she faced down the monster waiting for her at the altar. Draxon's eyes gleamed with triumph, his lips curled in a smug smile that made Jace's fingers itch for his blaster. But he held himself in check, waiting for the signal, the moment when all their careful planning would come to fruition. It came just as the officiant began the final blessing, a sudden commotion at the hall's grand doors. Jace tensed, ready to spring into action. But it wasn't Kothari guards that burst into the room, weapons drawn and faces grim. It was a ragtag band of rebels, led by a face Jace had never expected to see again. Xyloth, Myra's father, stood at the head of the group, a blaster in one hand and a fierce grin on his weathered face. "This wedding is over," he declared, his voice ringing out over the shocked gasps of the assembled guests. "By the authority of the Zalayan resistance, you are all under arrest for crimes against the people of the Outer Rim." Chaos erupted, Syndicate soldiers rushing to meet the rebel threat even as Draxon roared his fury. But Jace only had eyes for Mira. In one swift motion, she shed her demure persona like a cloak, her hand flying to a hidden holster beneath her gown. And then she was moving, a whirlwind of shimmering silk and deadly grace, fighting her way through the melee to her father's side. Jace was a mere heartbeat behind her, his own blaster spitting fire as he cut a path through the Syndicate ranks. Together, he and Mira fought back to back, a perfect pairing of skill and spirit, more in sync than ever before. In the end, it was almost anticlimactic. Draxon fell to a well-placed shot from Xyloth's blaster, his reptilian eyes widening in shocked disbelief as he crumpled to the floor. The rest of the Syndicate forces, seeing their leader fall, quickly lost heart, throwing down their weapons and fleeing into the desert. Jace turned to Mira, his heart in his throat as he took in her triumphant smile, the joy and relief shining in her eyes. "Mira," he breathed, reaching for her. "I." But before he could finish the sentence, Xyloth was there, sweeping his daughter up in a crushing embrace. "You brilliant, brave girl, the old man murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so proud of you. Mira clung to her father, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I doubted you. I should have known you'd never give up on me. Xyloth shook his head fiercely. Never, he vowed. I will always fight for you, my darling. Always. Jace watched the reunion with a bittersweet ache in his chest, knowing that his own role in this story had come to an end. Mira was safe now, back with her people, where she belonged. There was no place for a scoundrel like him in her new life. Quietly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, Jace turned to slip away. Only to find his path blocked by Mira, her hand on his arm and her eyes shining with something he hardly dared name. Where do you think you're going, Captain? She asked softly, a teasing lilt to her voice. Jace swallowed hard. I thought. But Mira was already shaking her head. You thought wrong, she murmured, stepping closer. My place is out there among the stars. With you. Her fingers twined with his, warm and sure. Unless you have any objections. Jace stared at her, hardly daring to breathe. Are you sure? He asked hoarsely. I'm no prince, Mira. I can't give you a palace or a crown. Myra's smile was brighter than a supernova. I don't want a palace, she said simply. I want freedom. Adventure. And a partner I can trust with my life. Her hand came up to cup his cheek, her thumb brushing over the stubble along his jaw. I want you, Jace Riker. If you'll have me. And what could Jace say to that but, yes. The kiss they shared there among the ruins of the Syndicate's power was sweeter than any he'd ever known, a promise and a celebration all in one. And as they broke apart, laughing and breathless and dizzy with joy, Jace knew that this was only the beginning.